you'd be asserting that the church ceases to exist because where Peter is, there is the church. So every time the Pope dies, the church ceases to exist and is sort of magically revived by the next papal election and acceptance. It's the most fruity idea that I've heard in a long time, and it's silly argument number 11. How can we get a true Pope? If you open any theology manual that deals with the nature of the church, a De Ecclesia, you will find that this subject has been dealt with by all of them. And the answer is that in the absence of the cardinals, the church, being a perfect society, which does not mean that she's perfect, although she is, it means she has all the powers and prerogatives that she needs to fulfil her function and her to be a true society of men. The church always has the right to provide herself with a visible head. As I say, pick your theologian and they'll explain this. So what they say is one of two things. Either the power devolves upon the Roman clergy because it's the Bishop of Rome that is the Pope, and therefore it's the clergy of Rome who have the right to select their bishop, or the power devolves upon the universal church, in which case the bishops generally can gather together and elect a Pope. Your reference to the 19 other popes out there is amusing. I'm not sure what it's meant to prove, except that it is a condition of moving to a papal election that one think the see is vacant. So it is true that the only people who have gone and elected a pope are people who think the see is vacant. This does not mean that the see is not vacant. And it also doesn't mean, as I said in my opening remarks, that the common tendency of sedevacantists is to elect popes. And the reason it doesn't mean that is because you only have to consider the maths. There are tens of thousands of sedevacantists, and there are maybe 500 adherents to false popes, other than the one in Rome. You say a pope cannot be deposed except by death. The problem with that statement, Mr. Sungenis, is it illustrates that you have not opened a single theology book on this subject, because every single theology book that deals with the nature of the church and the nature of the Roman pontiff states clearly that a pope who disappears into heresy would ipso facto lose the pontificate by divine law. To be able to stand here and say, therefore, that a pope cannot be deposed except by death, and then to further claim that if it were possible for a pope to be deposed other than by death, the Catholic Church would cease to exist, is the most extraordinary thing. And it illustrates to me that you have not really done any real research, and I suspect that if you left the Bellman forums and went to the books instead, that might be a useful thing to do. It is true that there must be a bishop with jurisdiction out there, as far as I can tell, because there must be always true successors of the apostles in the church. If there must always be true successors of the apostles in the church, there must always be true successors of the apostles in the church. And therefore, for example, a bishop who retired in, say, 1980 did not truly resign, because a resignation must be accepted by a superior. So we take a bishop who's not lost the faith, who's managed to get through the whole Vatican II revolution, and some of them did this without introducing the worst of the novelties and only doing what they thought was absolutely necessary under obedience, then you may well have a situation where a man who has episcopal orders, has an office in the Catholic Church, and has retained the Catholic faith, and therefore hasn't lost his office, resigns invalidly because the man he resigns to is not capable of receiving his resignation, and therefore remains a bishop of the Catholic Church with true jurisdiction. Such a notion is not even unlikely, in my view, and therefore solves the problem or the difficulty that's raised. The idea that all of the bishops of the Catholic Church lost their offices magically in 1958 or 1965 is just not a proposition supported by your typical sedevacantist, and certainly not by the respectable ones, and therefore it's not something we should have to deal with. But I do thank you for reading the forums, and I hope you've got something from them. You suggest that we cannot put our faith in Jesus Christ, who said that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. This is quite the opposite of the case. It is precisely because we do place our faith in Jesus Christ, who has said that the gates of hell will not prevail against the Catholic Church. But we cannot accept that this thing that is manifestly defected is the Catholic Church. And if you'd considered our arguments for more than 10 minutes, you would know that. Can a Pope fall into heresy? Bellarmine says no, but it's not certain. And therefore he proceeds to consider the 5 opinions. Now, you made the extraordinary statement that Bellarmine was the first to address this question. That is manifestly false. You then followed up by saying that he finds 5 opinions from tradition. How can you get 5 opinions on something from tradition which has never been considered? The truth is that Bellarmine took the 5 current opinions put forward by various theologians and showed that most of them were held by almost nobody, and taught as a matter of certitude that no non-Christian can hold an office in the church, and then resolved the problem by saying that a pope who did disappear into heresy would automatically lose his office. He went on to explain, and I thought I'd made this clear in my opening remarks, this is not because of ecclesiastical law, but because of divine law. And therefore, any suggestion that the Pope is above the canons, which is true, any suggestion that Cum ex apostolatus was abolished or abrogated by the promulgation of the Code, which it partly was, is true, but irrelevant, because no non-Christian can hold an office in the church, and anybody who's a public heretic is a non-Christian. And all of tradition teaches this, and this is Bellarmine's doctrine. You mentioned Pope Honorius. Pope Honorius wrote a letter which remained private to Sergius, and which all authorities agree was not heretical. The problem with the letter was that it counselled Sergius to remain silent on something that was Catholic doctrine. Honorius died with his reputation intact. After his death, he was condemned by the Fourth Council of Constantinople for allowing true doctrine to be impugned by silence. Firstly, Honorius was not a public heretic. He died with his reputation intact, and the letter was private. Secondly, it does not therefore involve the authority of Rome itself. Thirdly, Bellarmine, believe it or not, doctor of the church, was aware of the case and still taught what he taught. You mentioned Wycliffe and Huss being condemned, and you mentioned the doctrine that if a pope's evil, he loses the papacy, being condemned. We all know this. Bellarmine, more importantly, knew this, and all of the theologians who followed Bellarmine knew this, and therefore your argument, Mr. Sungenis, is merely a way of arguing against the whole of tradition and against all of the theologians, including doctors of the church, St. Robert Bellarmine and St. Alphonsus Liguori. Oh, beautiful. Pius XII, in his Apostolic Constitution, in which he laid down the rules for papal conclaves, lifted excommunications against cardinals. The most extraordinary interpretation of this was presented by Father Black is White Brian Harrison a few years ago, in which he said this means that a heretic can be pope. Which is, as I say, the most extraordinary thing, because it confuses ecclesiastical law with divine law, and it confuses ecclesiastical penalties with facts which arise from the very nature of the church and membership of the church. The reason a non-Catholic cannot be pope is because he's not a member of the church. If somebody is a non-member of the church by the crime of heresy, they are excommunicated. They are also a non-member of the church. They are two quite separate issues. The fact that an excommunication is lifted across the board by a pope doesn't bring any public heretic into the church by that act, and therefore it doesn't change anything in relation to our thesis, and Pius XII would not have thought it changed anything in relation to our thesis, because Pius XII had actually read a theology manual.